It's okay.
There we go.
We're good?
Yep.
Nice.
Yep.
Hey everybody. We're just going to go ahead and get started pretty soon. Pleasure to have everybody here. I think we're 1 minute away, so yeah. Oh, looks like it's time. First and foremost, I'd like to thank Robert Liu for hosting me here. It's a true honor, always an honor to speak with parents and students alike. And my name is Dan, and I'll be talking about and sharing my experiences, I think, with regards to how to really get into the best colleges today. I think it's a very popular topic, but I think it's also very misunderstood. And as somebody who's studied at UC Berkeley, specifically studied college admissions and career planning, as well as worked alongside people in the admissions community for the past about 10 years. I've learned a lot, and I think specifically with regards to Chinese families and Chinese parents. I've worked with students from all over the world, including in China, India, Bahrain, New Jersey, New York, obviously here in California. I thought it was a very important, for me to share some of those things that I learned, especially because I myself am Chinese, and I think it's a very unique experience to be here in America, or to be applying for schools in America if you are Chinese. And so, without further ado, let's get into it. I think the primary goal for today is to share insight that I think will ultimately help anybody here. So whether you're a student or you're a parent, who's interested in, a student getting into a college, right? I think there's a very certain way of thinking about it that is helpful, and there's also many ways of thinking about it that are not helpful, right? That are very dysfunctional and ineffective. And I've learned over the course of the last 16 years working with students and families that I think the Chinese community views the college admissions system in the United States in a very unique way, and unfortunately not always effectively, right? So the primary goal for today is to help inform you on how to rethink college admissions in a way that will help your student get to the best colleges, because I think it requires a rethink overall. So my story is this, from a whole range of things. I mean, ultimately I was born in Kentucky, so I'm an ABC, American Born Chinese, as I'm sure a lot of, students out there are. If you're watching this in your ABC, I'm sure you understand. It's a very unique situation, right? When your parents are obviously, immigrants from China, there's almost like two sets of standards, right? So I think I grew up with those two sets of standards. One, I had the Chinese standards, right, of working hard, getting good grades, and, basically managing my time well. And at the same time, I had these Western standards I had to adapt to, right? Learning English, right? My home language was Shanghainese. To understanding what independent thought was, or freedom was. And so that was certainly part of my story. And by the time I got to high school, I think I was a little bit confused by what? Well, one side of me wanted to make the world a better place, right? But at the same time, one side of me also wanted to make sure I made enough money. And I think a lot of students and parents go through the same struggle, right? Which is, how do we balance that? And for me, high school was a very challenging time. I was lost. Even though I was a very hard worker, I was the captain of the basketball team. I was a very good student, right, taking APs and honors classes. I was also very confused as to what I wanted to do with my own life. And I've met with a lot of students, not just Chinese students, but, white students, Indian students, Hispanic students, and it seems like it's a common struggle, right? I ended up studying business at UC Berkeley at the Haas School of Business, and worked in Wall Street, worked in startups. For any students who are watching this right now, I was even a professional video game tester when I was in college. In fact, to some degree, I'd always dreamt of working in the video game industry when I was a kid. But I ended up working ultimately at Google. So after I worked in startups and worked in the stock market, I worked at Google. And I thought that that's pretty much it. I think a lot of people my age at that time think of working at Google as, a huge accomplishment, and, why would you ever leave that, right? And so in short, ultimately, why that was, significant is because I found out at Google that I didn't want to be there. Only about 3 months in, my teammates started telling me basically that I needed to find a way out. And it was one of the most surprising and shocking things that I had ever heard in my life. I had just gotten to Google and I thought that this was the company that, I would spend, a good portion of my life at, and I was only basically just getting started when basically my teammates, who were some of the smartest and kindest people in the world, told me that basically, despite the free food and massage points and free travel to Chicago and New York, that it wasn't really all it seemed to be. And it's because I learned later that basically my teammates, who were all older than me at the time, were very unsatisfied with what they were working on. And so, after working at Google, I decided, hey, you know what? If there's a time to really work on something that really means something to me, it's now, right? In my 20s, before I have a mortgage and a family and all those other things, and kids, right? If I'm going to work on something I really am passionate about, it's now. And I started ReadyEdgeGo as a result of that. I left Google. I went back to school at UC Berkeley to study college admissions. My dream job coming out of high school was to be a teacher, specifically a math teacher. I love to teach, right? When I was in high school, I coached basketball. I was a science camp chaperone. I taught math to kindergartners all the way through, 10th grade. I love to teach, and it seemed like students really liked it too. But when I told my parents that I wanted to teach, they were like, no, don't do that. You're not going to make any money. And so you might be wondering, well, Dan, why didn't you leave Google and just go into teaching? Well, for me, I think what occurred to me as I thought about the problem in society, I realized that the hardest time in my life was in high school. And yes, I could teach, but maybe I can address that problem. And I asked myself one simple question: was what causes stress? Right? What causes the difficulty in high school? Specifically in high school, right? And I think it was basically a lack of information, right? It's fear, right? Fear that, oh my gosh, I'm not going to get enough, high enough score. Fear that I'm not going to take the right classes. Fear that I'm not going to get accepted, And, causing this problem, I think there's a tremendous lack of guidance, right, for our children, who are under a tremendous amount of stress and pressure to get to these insanely difficult schools to get into nowadays, right? Like the Stanford, Harvard, Yale, Penn, Columbias of the world, right? And I think, adding to the pressures, I think, especially within the Chinese community, there's a tremendous amount of importance and value placed into getting into a brand name school, right? We almost always, it's very rare that I encounter a Chinese parent who knows a college outside of the common names, right? Like Berkeley, Stanford, UCLA, Harvard, Yale, past, I would say, rank number 15 or 20, they really don't know any other schools. And I think that's a very dangerous, precedent, right, to give to our kids, right? And so, after studying admissions at UC Berkeley, I started ReadyEdgeGo, and with the simple goal, right, of just reducing that stress for everybody. And I think today, hopefully by the end of today's webinar, I'm sure you'll have some questions, but hopefully it will reduce your stress too. So let's get into it. Couple of questions that that I started with. One was, how can I help guide students in high school? Similar to that was, how can I reduce student and parent stress, right? Those are my questions. I think for parents, specifically Chinese parents, I've found that the questions that you guys have, even like my own parents had, was, how can I help my student get to the best colleges, right? Or another version or another question would be, how can I help my student stand out, right? Because for instance, in order to get to, say, UC Berkeley for engineering, or in order to get to MIT or Caltech, or in order to get to Harvard, right? Obviously, in order to help your student get those schools, they also have to stand out somehow, right? And, these questions, I think, are on almost all parents' minds nowadays, right? Whether you're living in Fremont or San Jose, or you're living in, say, China, right? We have students all over the world. I feel like these are the common questions that all Chinese parents typically have, right? Which is, how do I ultimately help my student, right? here are a couple examples of what I find Chinese parents typically do that don't work, right? So these examples do not help your students stand out, right? But unfortunately, we place so much time and money into these things, like what? Like playing a musical instrument, right? Or getting involved in sports, right? Oftentimes I talk to parents and they think that that's enough. It's like, okay, well, if my student has a 4.0, a 1560, and they've played sports and played a musical instrument, they're qualified, right? They're gonna get into Stanford. They're gonna get in, they're gonna have a good shot. And if that's the way that we're thinking about this, which I found to be is the common belief, then it is effectively a misbelief, right? It is not an accurate representation of what colleges actually look for, right? And a fun little stat is that every year Stanford rejects 400 students with perfect GPAs in SAT. Every year, right? You can Google search this yourself, and I would argue that that would be very much the same for Penn, Columbia, Harvard, Yale, right? And the reason is because why this doesn't help your students stand out is too many other students are doing the same exact things. How can your students stand out if they played piano and even reached the highest level if I can find thousands of other students who've done the same exact thing? Right? How can your students stand out if they take fine, they could self-study for another 3 or 4 or 5 extra AP exams if I could find thousands of other students who've done the same exact thing. It does not help your students stand out, right? And so I find that, typically our parents are so stressed out about pushing their kids to the brink, and their kids are in turn so stressed out and burnt out from this pressure to do these things that it doesn't lead to good results. 2, oftentimes it ruins relationships between students and their parents, right? And I know I know everyone here, I'm willing to bet everyone here knows what I'm talking about, right? There are a lot of students who burn out and their relationships with their parents aren't the best, right? So, I think this picture really illustrates what I've found though, nonetheless, where Chinese parents tend to spend most of their resources, right? And when I say resources, I'm talking in terms of what? Time, right? Money, time and money. Let's start with that, right? Time and money, right? I've tended to realize that a lot of parents send their students to classes, right? Extra classes, right? Whether that's, an after school program or, that's, maybe something slightly more sophisticated like Cosmos, right? Like a UC sponsored class, but there's a lot of emphasis on classes, right? Perhaps the one that really, really gets to my nerves is, when a student is already taking a class at school in, say, geometry, and then they're being sent to another school, another class after school for geometry, right? As if that student didn't have enough geometry already. And I'm sure, the logic there is, well, I want to give them further enrichment and make them even better. But again, guys, you have to think about this in terms of time as the most valuable resource, more valuable than money, to be honest with you. In that everything you choose to spend your time on will ultimately be scrutinized, right? So what you did maybe 60 minutes in, you probably could have spent 60 minutes doing something else, right? And I would argue that instead of sending our kids to classes after school, what if I told you that they can spend 60 minutes doing something else that would actually be perceived as 3 times more valuable, right? In the eyes of a college admissions officer at UC Berkeley, at Harvard, at Stanford, right? And so we tend to send our kids to these classes, piano classes, math classes, additional English classes, violin classes, swim classes, and we forget that a student is already going to class for school about 8 hours a day, right? And then they're being sent to classes after that for another 3 hours a day. That's a lot to ask for a 16-year-old who, by the way, has additional homework when they get home. And so that's additional work, right? And more often than not, I've seen, a lot of Chinese students really burn out as a result of this. And not only that, they see very suboptimal results when it comes to college, right? And I'm sure you guys all know the case of the kid who, had a 3.9 or 4.0 and a, 1560 and didn't get to Berkeley, didn't get to UCLA, right? Maybe did sports too, all right? Maybe even was the president of some club, but still didn't get in to a lot of their first choice schools. And then we wonder how. right? And most of those parents don't talk about that. They don't share that because they're embarrassed to share it, right? The worst case scenario that I ran into even recently was a student came up to me after they had applied. I had not known them before that, and they said that basically they had phenomenal qualifications and they didn't get to a single school because they got too cocky, right? They had assumed that their grades and their test scores and somehow their sports and music or other activities were good enough. And so they only applied to Harvard, Stanford, Yale, Berkeley, LA, thinking that for sure they would get in, and they didn't. We just can't let that happen anymore. I think as a community, as parents, and certainly as a mentor like myself, we can't. So why is it then, right? Why is it that, specifically I would argue that disproportionately the Chinese community still does those things, right? Why are we spending our time in areas that are not productive or not conducive towards great, amazing college admissions results, right? And I would argue because it used to work, right? Specifically, if we go back in time, like when I was growing up in the 1990s, right? Or when my brother was growing up in the 1980s, right? If you did just a couple of those things, you were qualified for some of the best schools like UC Berkeley, right? UCLA. You might have had to done a little bit more for, say, like the likes of a Stanford or Harvard. But generally, at the time, this is about, 25, 30 years ago, right? If you had a good GPA, you had a rigorous course load in APs, and you had SAT score, and maybe you did something else, right? It was enough. It was enough to get you over the edge, right, into some of these schools. But if you just accelerate that just 10 years later in the 2000s, right? This is when, for instance, I was graduating high school, right? I graduated American high school in 2007, right? It seemed like there was suddenly a shift. We needed a little bit more. It wasn't so much that you were involved outside of school. It was more particular, right? Schools now were looking for a little bit more leadership. And particularly, they wanted to see that you were involved in the lives of others, right? In service and volunteering, right? And so it used to work. But if we look at today, right? Top 75, top 100 universities in the United States of America use something called a holistic review or a holistic review process, right? And put simply, that includes everything from the past 30 years and then a little bit more, right? So we want a great GPA. We want to see that you challenge yourself. We want to see that you had a good test score like SAT or ACT. We want to see that you were leading. We want to see that you were serving. We want to see these other factors. And it's not just so simple as, say, doing a sport or being even, for instance, being a president of a club. That doesn't necessarily mean that you showed leadership, right? And you guys might be wondering, well, what do you mean? If a student was a president of a club or a captain of a varsity team, doesn't that show leadership? Not necessarily, right? Because, for instance, a lot of students start clubs nowadays that don't do anything. And okay, sure, you were a varsity player of the tennis team, but maybe you were just varsity rank number 1 because you were just good at tennis. Doesn't necessarily mean that you were a leader, might just mean that you were good at tennis, right? And that's, by the way, why we use the essays, the college application essays, to determine the substance behind the experience, right? So we look for these characteristics, right? Not just based on what you did, but how you explain their significance in something like a college application essay, and also in college application interviews, right? Some schools have interviews, right? Like, for instance, Brown University, USC, right? And Harvard, right? These schools offer interviews, and so they're trying to learn why you did something, not just what you did, right? And so another reason I think why we're still stuck almost back in time is because a lot of our parents came from a different world, right? With a different set of prerequisites, right? And this is also very true with a lot of our parents from India, right? Like, for instance, a lot of my clients, their families originated in all kinds of parts of India, where I think the requisites were a lot of the same. But what are the key differences here now that we're in the United States, right? Well, in places like China, and I would argue in India, right, there's generally a preference shown to those who have higher test scores and higher aptitude, right, as opposed to well-roundedness, right? It all comes down to one big test, right? As my parents used to tell me a lot, as I'm sure you've told your own children as well, and I'm sure students you've heard it one too many times, right? The rest of the world also, tends to, that's really all it really comes down to, right? That it's just how do you do on that test determines which colleges you qualify for. And I think perhaps most interestingly, once you're kind of working in a certain industry or field or line of work, you're stuck. That's kind of what you're expected to specialize in for the rest of your life, or at least a very good portion. And I'd say the United States is literally the opposite, right? Just to put it very frankly, right? It's the opposite, right? Over here, it's a much more about well-roundedness, right? As opposed to aptitude. For instance, why is it that we let a student with a C- or even a D+ proceed to the next grade? Right? It's because, as you can tell, right, it's a reflection that the United States doesn't place so much, severity and intensity on the numbers. They just want students to continue to move on and continue learning about everything, right? Furthermore, I would say if you look at GPA test scores, they only account for, roughly speaking, 50% of the end decision of a student's end college chances, right? And quite interestingly enough, I would argue for the hardest schools to get into, like Penn, Harvard, Stanford, the percentage weightage for numbers is much lower. And it's very simple why. In fact, you might be wondering, that can't be. How is that possible, Dan? How is it possible that the numbers aren't that important for these particular harder to get into schools? Wouldn't it be more important, you might be wondering? No, it's less important because there are too many students with the same numerical qualifications. It does not differentiate you from all those other thousands of students that have the same exact echelon of scores and grades, right? So you might be wondering, well, if it's not 50%, then what would it be? Well, I would argue for a school like Harvard or Stanford, it's much lower, right? Because it becomes a prerequisite requirement as opposed to a differentiating requisite, right? So I would argue it's something in the order of maybe 20%, right? And so as you start thinking about this logically, right, if that's the situation, and we're spending 90% of our resources, or maybe even 100% of our resources on maximizing grades, on sending our kids to boot camps for SAT scores, right? Are we spending our resources in terms of time and money in the right places? And I would argue we're not, right? I would argue we're not. And this is not just true for the Chinese community. I think this is true unequivocally for all parent communities today. There tends to be a bias towards the numbers, right? And I think the reason why is because the numbers are easy to track. They're tangible, right? Whereas character traits and qualities are a lot less tangible, right? So we tend to stick to the thing that seems to be safer, right? More concrete, right? And so, last but not least, the last point here is that the U.S. also promotes what I call professional mobility. What that means is that, let's say I were to study history, a major in history in college, which, by the way, is a very unpopular choice amongst, I would argue, all Asian communities, at least from what I've seen. It doesn't mean that I have to be a historian, right? It doesn't mean that I have to be a history teacher, right? In fact, my first teammate when I started working at Google was a history major, guys, right? She was a history major. My other teammate was an English major. My other teammate was a prosthetics specialist, so he was an expert in limbs, right, artificial limbs. And my boss was a political science major, okay? Yet we were all working in business. How is that possible? Is because in the United States, it's not about the degree that you have. It comes down to who you know and what you know. That determines what job you have. And I think that's relatively unique here in the United States, right? Furthermore, you can have a philosophy major, bachelor's degree, and still go to med school here, right? It's true. If you don't believe me, feel free to ask around, right? While it may not necessarily be common, it's very much possible. I would argue that's not necessarily practical in most other countries in the world, right? So moving on then, I believe that in order to really, see better results, right? Not just in terms of where our students end up in college, but I would argue even just in terms of our relationships with them, in terms of our own happiness, right? In order to counteract the fact that we came from a different world and a different time, I think it requires that we have to change the way we think. We have to change the way we look at this altogether, right? And it's a change in mind that I think is required before we act, okay? What would that entail? Well, I think the very first thing is contributing versus competing. Chinese people, myself being Chinese, I understand this, we tend to think of things in a very competitive way, right? And I think a lot of that is a result of we come from a world where there are so many people that it's elbow to elbow, even in the subway station. I remember when I was in Shanghai, I mean, just trying to get into the train was a battle, right? And we come from a world where there's just absolute no other choice. You have to compete for resources, limited resources at that. And we bring that over here and we teach our students, hey, right, you have to be the best, right? And my parents did the same thing. They said, look, whatever you do, you have to be the best, right? You have to work harder. You have to be better, right? And while that is very helpful in setting a certain standard, I would argue it's not the most effective when it comes to getting our kids into the best schools. And I say this because I've worked with countless valedictorians over the course of my life, in 16 years of working together with students in some capacity. And I've noticed one simple common pattern or denominator with them. The way they think of things is they're not competing, but rather they're trying to contribute, right? They're trying to help, right? Which makes sense if you think about the past history of those we cherish most and those we honor and celebrate. Disproportionately are the people who contributed to the world, right? Whoever that was, whether that was Confucius or that was Gandhi or that was, to some degree, even Kobe Bryant, beyond just the fact that he was a competitor in basketball. We cherish the fact that he contributed to the sport and transcended basketball to contribute to the overall community of humans, right? If there's one thing that we can start asking better, in my opinion, is not saying, how can I stand out, but rather, how can I give? Because the more your student contributes to their community, the more they will stand out. And if we keep asking our students, hey, how can you stand out? Then they will only just compete. And by competing, we won't stand out in the very first place, I would argue. So it's a change in the way we look at the world, right? How can we give versus how can we compete, right? The second part here is, encouraging students to really sign up early, I would say, for service opportunities, right? We oftentimes think of this as almost, it's not even a priority. It's almost like, oh, I have 40 hours of service I have to, accomplish to graduate. Well, let's just get rid of the 40 and we'll be done with it, right? Or, oh, well, ultimately grades are more important, so you should go to the summer camp that is a class to prepare you for the next math class, as opposed to what? As opposed to, how can we find you an opportunity to go serve your community, right? You might be wondering why. Well, if we were to go back to the holistic review slide, right, specifically, look right there, right? The point, I believe it's the 5th point, service. That point is a very heavily weighted point. Remember why I said the 100 points and I said, well, let's say for a school like Stanford, right, the numbers only account for 20. Well, of the 80 that are left, I would argue that service accounts for a pretty large amount of that, right? And this is, and in case you don't believe me, look at the essay questions that a college asks their applicants. Almost always, if not at least 3/4 of the time, they ask about a student's sense of service and responsibility for others. So what does that mean? That means when a student gets into high school, whether the student is 9th grade or a student is finishing high school, is in the 12th grade right now, right, and about to apply to college, ask yourself very simply, did we do a good job of really giving, right? Or does it sound like something somebody else did, right? And last but not least, I think building continuity in those service areas, right? I get this a lot from Chinese or Chinese parents is about, oh, well, my student's been playing piano, or my student's been playing this sport like swim for the last, X amount of years. Isn't it important for me to show that continuity across for the rest of high school? No, it's not. To be completely honest with you, it's not. Okay, to be frank. But I would argue, yes, it is important to show continuity in terms of service. So it's not good enough to just have served in some kind of volunteer, capacity at a homeless shelter for, say, 40 hours for only 2 months out of the year for 1 year, and that's it. I would argue no. You absolutely have to continue something that you really, really enjoy and like giving, right? To build a powerful service narrative. Okay, so if there's one category that I'm going to emphasize very heavily today is actually giving, right? And by the way, by giving, I would argue you're also leading, right? So you're actually checking two of those major boxes when it comes to how a college assesses its candidates, right? The next is learning versus studying. We have this very fond habit of asking our students how you did at school, right? We say, oh, how did you do on the test? What are your grades? Show me your report card. There's this emphasis on performance. And we completely disregard the fact that a student should have actually learned something, right? So it's a very simple adjustment in terms of how we talk to our students. Instead of asking, what grade did you get? Or what score did you get? How about we say, what did you learn? And you can do this today, for instance, right? You can even say, hey, what did you learn from the last year? And if a student struggles to respond, that means they probably didn't learn anything. And that is a red flag, right? But most importantly, as a parent, I think if you ask your student, what did you learn, as opposed to what score did you get, what you're doing is you're actually encouraging your student to learn as opposed to perform, right? And why this is so effective is if you're encouraging your student to learn properly, they will perform very well. It only happens when a student doesn't learn something properly that they don't perform well much at all, right? There's only so much procrastinating and studying you can do to get away with that, right? If your foundations aren't strong, you're just not going to do well in that subject eventually, right? And by the way, guys, we see this all the time on SAT scores. You guys might be curious why, for instance, your student is stuck at, say, I don't know, let's say a 1390 or a 1440, maybe why they can't break 1500 very easily. Yet they have a 4.0 or 3.9 is because I would argue that their foundations in math and or critical reading and writing aren't strong. Yeah, sure, they got A's in the class. That's your performance, right? But in order to do well on the standardized test, I would argue your foundations must be strong. And so we have to focus on learning, right? And so, that leads me to saying you got to foster natural areas of curiosity. Every single student is curious about something. I promise you this. They're curious intellectually about things, right? And you have to help them foster those things. We don't want to press them to study something and only one thing. We want to foster their natural curiosities, right? And we want to pay attention to those things, what those are over time as that changes, right? And by the way, I would not ever count video gaming as a, as a natural area of curiosity. That, in my opinion, is much more a hobby, right? Something that may, create meaning to some degree, but it's not necessarily curiosity. Which brings me to an interesting point, which is emphasizing both depth and breadth, right? Okay, let's say your student wants to be an engineer. All right, or let's say your student wants to be a doctor. Well, just because they want to be a doctor doesn't mean that's the only thing that exists. They should probably also start learning about other things, right? In fact, I would argue if you want to be a doctor today, it doesn't mean you just have to be good at biology and chemistry or anatomy. You actually have to understand the greater, I would say, the context, right? Today, the average age of a matriculant to med school is 28 or 29 years old, not 22. So college students don't just magically go to med school all the time. No. The average age of a med school matriculant is 28 years old. Okay, what does that mean? That means med schools are effectively looking for people with life experience, not just a college degree, in the United States at least, all right? And so in order to analyze for life experience, it's very holistic. We want a student to learn about many different things, not just about biology and chemistry, but also about economics, also about poverty, right? Because nowadays doctors are being placed in very poor areas. If a doctor is only good at biology and chemistry and don't really understand why I keep saying the same gunshot victim or why I keep saying the same stab wound victim, right? That doctor will probably not last longer than a year, all right? So going on, it's this more philosophical, I think, recommendation, which is, I think, prioritizing living over achieving, right? Chinese community is very good at performance-centric thinking. I'm going to invite everyone here for a moment to counter that, right? And understand that college, a brand name, is overrated. That a major itself is overrated. And, that even to some degree school is overrated. I think we put so much emphasis in achievements that we forget to capture the moments, right? We forget basic things, like for instance, the fact that, okay, if my student doesn't get to UC Berkeley, life is not over, right? That there is no data that proves if you go to San Jose State, you will be any less off better than, say, somebody who goes to Berkeley. If you can find research that proves that, then please, I want you to send that to me now. Dan@ReadyEdgeGo.com, right? And I believe this is a result. We obsess, though, nonetheless, with brand names because it almost provides us a false sense of value, right? It's like, oh, I can brag that my student went to UC Berkeley, right? But we forget that this may itself, right, plague our relationship with our students, right? Our student, maybe if our student is not meant to go to UC Berkeley, right, we shouldn't set that expectation for them, right? More often than not, I feel like a lot of students are, they're given goals that they just cannot reach. And so, we're setting up our students for failure that way, and most importantly for sadness, right? So, that I think, really honing down on the fact that I think, all students are human beings at the end of the day, right? They're not machines that need to be optimized, right? They're people, just like every one of us, with feelings, with emotions, with unique capabilities and unique interests, right? I think it's very important to treat our students as humans as opposed to something that needs to be optimized for performance, right? And so if you, I think, really, think about spending your time and money in places that are much more natural, right? In terms of a student's unique interests, in terms of a student's, curiosities, and even in terms of a student's abilities, right? For instance, I would argue not all students are able to get a 1500 on the SAT. That's okay, right? Naturally, if you focus on your student and not anybody else's, right? And just focus on really helping your student grow as an individual, as a human being, as a contributing member of society, I can personally guarantee you that your student will naturally not only be happier and you will be less stressed out, but they will see much better results as a result, right? And if you don't believe me, look, we've used the same exact methodology and philosophy here since I started this company in 2012. And 100% of our students have gotten into a target school or better, right? Oftentimes with money. Okay, so we're not here pushing our students mindlessly to get a test score, to take, 3 or 4 AP classes when in reality they should probably only take 1 or 2, right? We have to treat each student with respect to their interests and their capabilities. And some additional topics that I think, that I would propose perhaps, for some follow-up meetings or video seminars I'd be happy to put on is, things like, working smart versus working hard. I've tended to find that a lot of Asian students work really hard on the SAT or really hard at school, and they're not working smart, right? So they're wasting a ton of time. And as a result, parents waste a lot of money, right? Just working really hard, right? Guys, we have to work smarter before we work harder, right? Next is, the secret behind motivating our students, right? Oftentimes I find that Asian parents, find their students to be really unmotivated, right? Or maybe there's issues with time management, right? Well, it turns out, guys, there's a very simple solution to this. And it's not the motivation that's the issue. It's not time management the issue. Those are basically skills and behaviors. I would argue it's very much about basically identifying a student's interests. That's the issue, right? And lastly, this is a real one that's close to me because I used to be a professional video game tester. I was consuming way too much time every day playing video games. And I would argue today it's probably the greatest challenge that all parents face today, which is video game addiction, right? I can't tell you how prevalent this is today. I mean, there are so many students that are addicted to playing games like Fortnite or League of Legends or whatever have you. And especially since these games are free nowadays, most of them, it's easy for us as, as parents, as mentors, right, to just say, oh, yeah, sure, I'm working really hard, they can play their games. It's a real threat. And I think the American Psychological Association just recently named video game addiction as a real thing. And I think that was long overdue, right? And I think it poses a very serious threat to our students' mental health, and their natural development as human beings. And so if you have any thoughts or any further questions, I strongly advise you to reach out anytime. If you go to our website, I'd be more than happy to meet you in person, or sorry, over video for free. We're putting on a special, basically a promotion just for this community, because for me it means a lot. I think sharing this wisdom and this knowledge and helping change minds to see better results as a result means everything to me. It's why I left Google. It's why I left Wall Street, right? To ultimately help our parents and our families and ultimately students live happier, healthier lives that are much more effective. So reach out anytime. You can schedule a free meeting if you use the code REFER, REG, so that's REFER, REG, all caps. You can schedule a free initial consultation anytime, or you could just reach out to me, dan@ReadyEdgeGo.com. I'd be more than happy to talk. But until the next time, and I'll stay in touch with Robert in case this was informative or helpful, thought-provoking, what have you. Feel free to request additional topics, and I'd be more than happy, to present on additional topics and share my love and wisdom. So thanks for your time, guys. I hope you enjoy.